On a seemingly normal night show, Jimmy Fallon is left speechless when Sandra Bullock's interview is interrupted by a surprise walk-on from Keanu Reeves. The unexpected reunion sends the audience into a frenzy as the two revisit their iconic on-screen chemistry, share emotional memories, and hint that this might not be the last time they work together. I still remember the night the whole studio forgot it was just a talk show. It began like any other Tuesday taping, but by the end of it, 3 people and a few million strangers were quietly rethinking what it means to show up for someone you once loved and then lost without a goodbye. The city outside was loud and electric, but inside Studio 6B, Jimmy Fallon paced behind his desk with a stack of blue cue cards in his hand. He'd done this walk 1,000 times. Monologue, silly game, celebrity guest, viral clip, go home. Lately, though, he'd started to feel a strange hollowness behind the laughter, like he was throwing confetti over something important he could never quite touch. Tonight's big guest was Sandra Bullock, funny, charming, guaranteed crowd pleaser. On paper, it was just good television, but Jimmy kept thinking about an email his producer Mia had sent him that morning. "Trust me, let this one breathe, don't rush the moments." He didn't know what she meant, but the way she'd said it made a part of him sit up straight. Backstage, Sandra sat in the makeup chair, smiling at her reflection in that practiced, professional way actors learn when they've had cameras in their faces for decades. The stylist talked, the makeup artist laughed, and Sandra nodded, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Earlier that week, she'd watched an old clip from the action movie that had changed her life, the one where she'd spent months flying down highways and jumping impossible gaps in a bus with a quiet, gentle co-star who made every dangerous stunt feel strangely safe. They had promised to stay friends forever. Then careers exploded, life happened, phone calls got missed, messages got shorter, and eventually, without a single fight, silence had settled between them like concrete. She hadn't seen him in years. She told herself that was normal, that Hollywood was like that. But a small, unhealed part of her still wondered if she had failed a good person when he needed her most. Across the hall in a cramped green room that wasn't on the schedule, Keanu Reeves sat alone on a worn couch, elbows on his knees, fingers laced so tightly his knuckles were white. He'd agreed to this surprise only after Mia had looked him in the eye and said, "It's not for ratings, it's for closure for both of you." He believed her, but his chest still felt like it was full of gravel. Years earlier, he had disappeared into his own grief and confusion, walking out of premieres, ignoring calls, letting friendships crumble because he didn't know how to show his brokenness to anyone. Sandra had been one of the few people who'd seen the quiet kindness under his awkwardness, and instead of leaning on her, he'd simply stopped calling. Tonight, under the studio lights and the eyes of millions, he wanted to do something his younger self had never been able to do. Step toward the person he'd hurt, not away from them. Mia stood in the doorway watching him, headset crooked, clipboard pressed to her chest. She was the architect of this entire reunion, but not because she wanted a viral thumbnail. Her little brother had spent months in a hospital after an accident, surviving the endless nights by watching old movies where Sandra and Keanu raced against ticking clocks and impossible explosions. "They made me believe people can be brave and kind at the same time," he'd told her once. When he died, Mia promised herself she would help create moments of real bravery and kindness whenever she could, even in something as noisy and chaotic as late-night TV. This reunion was her quiet rebellion against empty entertainment. 2 good people, finally getting a chance to say the words they'd swallowed for far too long. Minutes later, the show was in full swing. Jimmy's monologue landed perfectly, the audience roared at his jokes, the band hit every cue. When Sandra walked out, the room erupted. She hugged Jimmy, laughing that warm, rolling laugh that made everyone feel like they were in on the same joke. They played a silly game where she had to reenact her old action scenes using toy cars and cardboard buildings on Jimmy's desk. She grabbed a tiny plastic bus, leapt it over a stack of coffee mugs, and the audience screamed as if it were the real thing. There was action, there was fun, and for a moment Jimmy forgot all about his quiet unease and just enjoyed the chaos. But between the jokes, his eyes kept drifting to Sandra's face. Every time the crowd calmed down, there was a flicker there, something thoughtful, almost sad, before she snapped back into her usual brightness. Then the cards in Jimmy's hand shifted, and he noticed one he didn't recognize, written in Mia's handwriting. Ask about the one person she wishes she'd called back, it read. He frowned for half a second, then decided to trust it. The laughter faded, the band softened to a gentle hum, and Jimmy leaned forward, voice low and sincere. He asked Sandra if there was anyone, just one person, she wished she'd reached out to before it was too late. The question seemed to hit her like a wave she hadn't braced for. Her smile faltered. She looked down at her hands, tracing the edge of Jimmy's desk with her fingers as if she were feeling the edge of some invisible cliff. "There is," she said quietly, the playful energy dissolving into something far more fragile. She talked about a friend who had always been kind, always patient, the kind of man who opened doors, carried heavy boxes, and listened more than he spoke. She said they had laughed together through explosions and stunt rehearsals, shared bruises and inside jokes, and then one day, without a fight, without a reason she understood, he had vanished from her life. She admitted on live television that part of her had been too proud, or maybe too scared, to go after him. The studio was so silent you could hear the cameras hum. Jimmy opened his mouth, about to ask the question everyone at home was screaming in their heads. Who was he? When a red light started blinking on the edge of his desk. A cue from the control room. The band's melody shifted. The doors at the side of the stage, the ones guests walked through at the beginning of their segments, slowly swung open. Bright white light flooded the doorway, turning the figure standing there into a dark, motionless silhouette. Sandra looked up just as the audience gasped and started to rise to their feet, hands flying to their mouths. Jimmy turned in his chair, his face frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. And there in that blinding doorway stood the one person Sandra never thought she'd have to face. At least not like this, not with the entire world watching. He stepped out of the doorway slowly, as if he knew one wrong move could shatter the room. The white light behind him softened, and the silhouette turned into a face everyone recognized long before their brains caught up with their eyes. Keanu Reeves, in a simple black suit and worn boots, stood at the edge of the stage, hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets like he'd just walked into the wrong classroom. For a second, the studio forgot how to breathe. Then the audience exploded. People shot to their feet, screaming his name, phones flashing like a sudden storm of stars. Jimmy's jaw dropped open so wide it looked like a bit he'd rehearsed, except this time there was no punchline. He glanced helplessly at the cameras, then back at Sandra as if silently asking, "Are we actually doing this?" Sandra didn't move. She stared at Keanu as though the years between them were a sheet of glass, and she was afraid that if she blinked, it would crack and he would vanish again. All the noise around her became distant, like it was happening down the hallway of a hospital or behind a heavy door. In the middle of that roar, what she really heard was the absence of all the calls he never made, and all the calls she never returned. Keanu's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he wondered if the microphones could pick it up. He'd faced explosions, stunt crashes, and crowds before, but none of that had ever required this kind of courage. With every step he took toward Jimmy's desk, he could feel old shame rising like heat under his skin. He remembered the last time he'd dialed Sandra's number, hands shaking, desperate for a voice that made the world seem less cruel. He remembered letting it ring, then hanging up before it went to voicemail because he felt stupid for needing anyone that much. Tonight, he had no intention of hanging up. Jimmy finally snapped back into host mode, leaping from his chair like the floor was on fire. "What?" he shouted, half laughing, half screaming. He ran toward Keanu, hugging him with the wild enthusiasm of every fan in the building. The band launched into a frantic mashup of music from their old movie, horns blaring. It should have turned the moment into a joke, but it didn't. It just made the whole thing more unreal. Keanu's eyes never left Sandra. When Jimmy guided him over to the couch, she stood up slowly, her hands trembling just enough that she crossed her arms to hide it. For years, she had prepared herself for a possible reunion at an awards show, a charity event, maybe a quiet restaurant. She never pictured it under blinding lights with cameras inches from her face and millions of strangers ready to freeze-frame every flicker of emotion. She had spent a career learning how to perform through anything. But this wasn't a performance. This was the one person who knew what it felt like to cling to the top of a runaway bus together at 3 in the morning and still find a reason to laugh. "Hi," Keanu said, soft but clear, like he was afraid to lean on the word too hard. Sandra's laugh came out halfway between a sob and a joke. "You're late," she said, the corners of her mouth trembling into a smile. About what, 15 years late? The crowd roared, relieved by the humor, but the tension in her eyes told another story. Keanu nodded, accepting the hit, not deflecting it. Traffic, he replied gently. You know how these buses are. That cracked something open. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't the dramatic slow-motion hug people imagine from movies. It was clumsy and tight and very, very human. Jimmy backed up, giving them space, his expression softening into something that wasn't about ratings at all. As the audience settled, Jimmy eased them onto the couch. Okay, he said, still half-dazed. This is insane. I feel like I just walked into a fan fiction written by the internet. Sandra wiped the corner of her eye with a fingertip and shook her head. If the internet wrote this, she said, I'd be wearing a ball gown and he'd be riding in on a horse. Next segment, Jimmy joked weakly, earning a polite laugh from the crowd. But then he lowered his voice. You two haven't seen each other in a long time, right? Years, Keanu admitted. He didn't look away. Too many. A part of Sandra wanted to keep the mood light. Tell another story about wild stunt days and rubber buses, and how he taught her how to roll out of a moving car without falling on her face. But another part of her, the tired part that woke up at 3 in the morning replaying old conversations that never happened, refused to dodge the truth again. Do you remember the bridge sequence? She asked him suddenly. He smiled, surprised. How could I forget? You almost broke my ribs. Well, you shouldn't have tried to be a hero, she shot back, but her voice had softened. She turned to Jimmy. There was this one night. We'd been shooting for, I don't know, 14 hours. We're on this rig pretending a bus is about to jump a gap in a freeway. Everything is wired and supposedly safe, but things started to go wrong. As she talked, the studio around them seemed to fall away, replaced in everyone's imagination by bright set lights and the smell of burning rubber. She described how the bus had jerked too hard, how she'd lost her footing, how for one dizzy, weightless second she'd thought she was going to fall off the edge of the rig, and how Keanu had grabbed the back of her vest, braced his legs, and held her up like she weighed nothing. You didn't let go, she said quietly, more to him than to Jimmy. That's the job, he replied. No, she insisted, a tremor in her voice. The job is to hit your mark. The job is to say your line, holding on when you're tired and scared and it hurts. That's not the job, that's who you are. The audience murmured, moved by the way she was looking at him, like she was seeing the same 20-something kid from all those years ago instead of the man in front of her. Keanu swallowed hard, embarrassment and gratitude warring in his face. He'd spent his whole life trying to do the right thing quietly, almost apologetically. Having it named out loud felt like someone had turned a spotlight on parts of himself he'd assumed no one noticed. Jimmy leaned forward. So what happened, he asked gently, between then and now? Keanu's fingers twisted together. He glanced at the cameras, then at Mia standing just out of frame by a stage pillar, her headset slightly askew. Mia gave him a tiny nod that said, "You're safe. Tell the truth." I happened, he said finally. Life happened. I pulled away. I thought disappearing would hurt people less than asking for help. Sandra's breath caught. She could feel the entire audience hanging on his words, but all she heard was the echo of that night she'd seen his name light up her phone and chosen not to answer. Competing emotions crashed through her. Anger, relief, guilt, affection, so fast she could barely separate them. Jimmy's next question hovered in the air, obvious and impossible. Why didn't you call him? Why didn't either of you fight for that friendship? He didn't say it yet, but his eyes did. Keanu turned to Sandra, his voice almost a whisper. I owe you a real apology, not the kind you say on a red carpet, the kind where you don't look like the hero when it's over. The room went completely still. Sandra's heart pounded in her ears. She knew if he said those words in front of the world, there would be no going back to pretending they were just old co-stars with busy lives. Jimmy looked between them, then into the nearest camera. Do you want to have that conversation here? He asked softly. With all of us, or not at all? Sandra's throat tightened. Every instinct honed by decades in show business screamed at her to smile, change the subject, tell a charming story, move on. But another voice inside, the one that kept her awake at night, whispered that this might be the only chance they would ever get to mend something real. She inhaled slowly, eyes glistening. "We can," she said, her voice shaking. "But not unless we tell them the part I never told you." Keanu's brow furrowed. "What part?" he asked. She held his gaze, her answer lodged at the edge of her tongue, knowing that whatever she said next could either heal them or hurt them all over again. She took a breath as if she were about to dive underwater. The lights felt hotter now, the air thicker. "The part I never told you," Sandra began, eyes locked on Keanu's, "is that you weren't the only one who disappeared." The crowd shifted, a low rustle of curiosity moving through the seats. Jimmy leaned back, giving them the floor. For once, he didn't try to smooth anything over with a joke. "You remember that year everything went crazy?" she asked. "You lost someone close to you. The tabloids were everywhere. Our friends kept saying you weren't returning calls." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "Your manager called me. He said, he's not doing great. Maybe you could reach out. He listens to you." Keanu blinked, surprised. "He called you?" "He did," she said, shame flickering across her face. "I was on a set halfway around the world pretending to be brave and strong and funny, but my own life was falling apart. My marriage was cracking, my mom was sick, and I was hanging on by a thread. I told myself I didn't have room for anyone else's pain." Her mouth twisted. "So I said I'd call you later, and I didn't." The studio went quiet. Even the band stopped fidgeting with their instruments. Sandra's confession hung in the space between them like a fragile object that could shatter with one careless word. "A month after that," she continued, "you left me a voicemail. You didn't say much, just that you were sorry for dropping off the map, that you hoped I was happy. You sounded tired, not movie set tired, soul tired." Her eyes shone now, but she refused to wipe them. "I listened to it in my trailer. I stared at my phone for an hour, and then I put it face down and went back to set because there were 100 people waiting for me to hit my mark." Keanu's shoulders sagged. He remembered that message, the way his voice shook, the way he'd hoped just hearing her laugh again might pull him out of the fog. He told himself she never got it. A glitch. A lost signal. Some technical error that kept him from looking like a fool. "You never replied," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was the stunned realization that the story in his head had been wrong. "I didn't," she said, the words tasting like rust. "I told myself you'd be fine, that you were strong, that if I opened that door, I'd have to admit I was." Her fingers twisted together in her lap. "And then time did what time does. It built a wall and called it life." It was easier to wave from across red carpets than to say, "I failed you when you needed me." A murmur rolled through the audience, not of judgment, but of recognition. People shifted in their seats, thinking of their own unanswered messages, their own "I'll call later" that turned into never. Keanu looked down at his hands, jaw working. He'd carried the story for years that he was the problem, that he pushed people away until they stopped trying. Hearing that someone he loved had also been drowning, and that she'd chosen survival over heroism, didn't make the past hurt less, but it did something unexpected. It made him feel less alone in his failures. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away," he said, voice low. "I didn't want you to see how bad it got. I thought if I kept our memories clean, I'd be doing you a kindness." Sandra gave a wet, incredulous laugh. "We were two idiots trying to protect each other by not showing up. That's not kindness. That's fear in a very polite costume." Jimmy swallowed hard, visibly moved. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this on a talk show," he admitted, mostly to himself. "People usually come here to promote a movie, not dissect their emotional cowardice on national television." The crowd chuckled softly, grateful for the release, but the weight of the moment remained. Keanu looked up, eyes brighter than before. "I'm sorry," he said to her, every syllable steady. "Not just for vanishing, for assuming you didn't care, for turning you into a villain in my head because it was easier than admitting I'd hurt you first." Sandra's shoulders shook. "And I'm sorry," she answered, her voice almost breaking, "for choosing the camera over the phone, for being more afraid of crying with you than of driving a bus off a pretend cliff, for letting pride and exhaustion be louder than friendship." The apology landed between them like a fragile peace offering. No swelling music, no perfect cut, just two people sitting under two bright lights, finally saying the things their younger selves had been too proud to admit. Behind the cameras, Mia pressed her clipboard against her chest, fighting her own tears. This raw, clumsy honesty was the moment she'd hoped for when she'd risked her job pitching this insane reunion. But she also knew they were running out of time. The show had a schedule, and the control room was already in her ear, asking if they could move to the next segment. She ignored them. Instead, she mouthed to Jimmy, "Play it." Jimmy read her lips, eyes widening. He hesitated for half a second, then turned back to Sandra and Keanu. "There's someone who asked if they could be part of this conversation," he said gently. "We weren't sure if we'd show it, but it feels like the right moment." Sandra wiped her eyes. Keanu glanced toward the monitors, wary. The screens around the studio flickered from the show's logo to a paused video frame. A hospital room dimly lit, with a teenager in a faded t-shirt grinning at the camera, wires and monitors quietly blinking around him. "Who is that?" Sandra whispered. Mia's hand shook slightly as she pushed the button in the control room that would start the video, knowing that what came next might change the direction of all their lives. The video sprang to life with a soft crackle. The boy on the screen adjusted his pillow, pushing a mop of unruly hair out of his eyes. He looked thin, but his smile was stubborn, the kind of smile that refused to admit how bad things were. "Hey, Jimmy," he said, voice a little raspy. "Hey, Sandra, hey, Keanu, if they actually got you all in the same room, that is. This is already the coolest thing that's ever happened to me." A soft wave of laughter rolled through the audience, tinged with something tender. On the couch, Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the screen like it might disappear if he blinked. The boy continued, "My name's Lucas. I've been in and out of this hospital more times than I've been to the movie theater. But the nights I couldn't sleep, I'd watch that crazy bus movie you guys did, over and over. The nurses got sick of it." He grinned. "Sorry, Becky." A woman's voice laughed faintly in the background of the recording. "You know what I loved," Lucas said. "It wasn't just the explosions. It was that you two were scared, but you still did the right thing. You fought, you yelled, you joked, but you never left each other on that bus. That made me think maybe being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. Maybe it just means you stay." Sandra felt something inside her crack wide open. The fiction of those scenes, the perfectly lit shots and rehearsed lines, collided with the very real distance she and Keanu had put between themselves. She glanced sideways at him and saw the same realization washing over his face. Lucas shifted, his expression growing serious. "My sister works on your show now," he said proudly. "Her name is Mia. She's the one who told me how in real life people can drift apart even if they never meant to, so I had this idea." He looked straight into the lens. "What if you guys did something braver than jumping a bus? What if you showed up for each other again, but this time without a script?" A collective exhale fluttered through the studio. Mia's cover was gone now. The whole room turned to look at her. She froze, then gave an awkward, watery wave, her headset slightly askew. Jimmy's features softened with sudden understanding. On the screen, Lucas smiled gently. "I don't know if I'll get to see that happen," he admitted. "But I want people watching to know this. Heroes aren't the ones who save the world in one big moment. They're the ones who send the text, call back, show up to the hospital room, forgive the friend who messed up. They're the ones who stay on the bus when it would be easier to jump off." Sandra's tears spilled over now, silent and unhidden. Keanu's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The studio felt less like a TV set and more like a church, or a hospital waiting room, or the kind of quiet kitchen where families have the conversations that change everything. Lucas glanced off-screen, then back. "So if you're seeing this, it means Mia pulled it off. You're all there. And I just want to say thank you for the movie, for the laughs, for teaching me that courage can look messy." He paused, then added with a crooked grin, "Oh, and Jimmy, if you don't at least try to get them to do one more crazy thing together, I'm haunting your studio." The video froze on his grin, then faded out. The studio lights seemed harsher after the soft glow of the hospital room. No one spoke at first. Jimmy cleared his throat, eyes glassy. "Lucas passed away 6 months ago," he said quietly. "We weren't sure if we'd show that, but Mia, she believed he was asking all of us for something bigger than a clip." Mia stood just off stage, tears streaming down her face, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Every part of her wanted to apologize for ambushing them with so much emotion, but another part, the part her brother had strengthened in her, knew this was exactly what he would have wanted. Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He was braver than both of us." "Yeah," Keanu agreed, his voice rough. "He still is." Jimmy inhaled, then spoke up, the producer and him wrestling with the human. "Look, we were supposed to go to commercial," he said, glancing toward the control room. "But I don't care, we'll lose some ads. NBC, I'm sorry, I'll make more TikToks for you or something." A gentle ripple of laughter loosened the room a little. I feel like we can't leave this here as some sad, beautiful moment and then say, we'll be right back with a cooking segment." He swiveled on his chair to face them fully. "Lucas asked for one more crazy thing, not a stunt for ratings, something real. So I want to ask you both right now with everyone watching, what do you want to do with this second chance? Not just between you two, but for people like him." Sandra looked out at the audience, at the strangers who were suddenly part of the most intimate conversation of her adult life. She thought of the years she'd spent playing strong women on screen while avoiding the messiest truths in her off-camera relationships. Her chest still felt raw, but inside that rawness was a spark of something fierce. "I'm tired of pretending bravery only looks good," she said slowly. "I want to start with the ugliest version of it." She turned to Keanu, eyes steady despite the tears. "I want us to do something for kids like Lucas, not a one-night charity gala where we read a teleprompter and go home, something that costs us time, energy, comfort." Keanu nodded almost instantly, as if the idea had been waiting at the edge of his mind. "We could fund a program," he suggested. "Action training and film workshops for kids in hospitals. Let them make their own crazy movies. Give them something to look forward to besides test results." Jimmy's face lit up through the grief. "We can host a special," he added. "Live from the hospital, bring the show to them instead of the other way around." The possibilities spilled out between them like light breaking through a cracked door. For the first time that night, the future felt bigger than their shared regret. "But I need something else first," Keanu said suddenly, turning to Sandra, "before we make any grand promises in Lucas's name." She frowned slightly cautious. "What?" He hesitated, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. "I don't want this to be another beautiful moment that fades when the credits roll," he said. "We made that mistake once. We can talk about foundations and specials and programs, but if we walk out of here and go back to texting twice a year, we're lying to that kid." Sandra's stomach flipped. The actor in her wanted to freeze the night exactly as it was, a perfect arc of confession and redemption. The woman in her knew the harder part would come after in the quiet spaces no camera could glamorize. "What are you asking?" she murmured. Keanu exhaled, then met her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even him. "I'm asking if you're willing to get back on the bus with me," he said. "For real this time, no stunts, no script, just the messy ride of actually being in each other's lives again." The room held its breath as she searched his face, weighing fear against hope, old wounds against the possibility of something new. For the first time all night, she had no quip, no polished line, no safe way out. Her lips parted, ready to answer. But at that exact moment, the floor manager's frantic, "Wrap it up," signal flashed in Jimmy's peripheral vision, and the control room cut to the show's closing music, forcing them toward a decision that could not be postponed much longer.